Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. Conversation you've heard so far, and thank you for that, has been with me and Peter Vale. And I would always begin, it seemed by habit, to say, well, Peter, and then we'd start. And he, in his really jolly way, would say, well, before we go ahead, David, I want to say something. And he would. And I loved that. Well, Peter's not with us any longer. Passed away in late March. I don't know of anyone in my whole life who's fought harder to stay alive. And he was definitely looking forward to these conversations that were scheduled for April. So I'm going to have these conversations and hope that Peter's spirit is with us. In fact, I don't need to hope. I know it will be. We'll keep looking into the nature of practice. We'll keep trying to find the answer to the question, practice? Because that's, I think, what Peter would want. So this time you're going to meet Eric Dent, one of Peter's students in the MBA and the doctoral programs at George Washington University, who's had a long and still very energetic and dynamic career since those days. I think you're really going to enjoy not only learning about Eric as a practitioner and teacher, but also learning more about Peter Vale, and maybe even a little bit about me. Well, folks, in starting out this conversation, I feel like I'm one hand clapping, the other hand being, as you've known from listening to all these other episodes, the hand of Peter Vale, the hand that, in a way, raised the guest that I'm sharing with you today and me to a higher aspiration, I believe, to be involved in the organization development and organization behavior world. So it's my pleasure just to introduce you in a moment to Eric Dent. Now, Eric was someone that Peter was really looking forward to talking to here in April when we developed a list of who he would like to bring to conversation. And he said, no matter who else you get, please be sure you get Eric, because he hadn't heard and talked with you in a while, Eric, and he wanted that opportunity, as will be the case for Kathy Ross coming up in a couple of weeks. So you and Kathy were doctoral mentees and students in the early 90s. I was Peter's student in the late 60s and early 70s. So we have that in common, and therefore we're not really today working with one hand. We have the hand of Peter in our conversation today. I think probably the best way to begin is to have folks know what you're doing right now, and that may lead us all the way back to when you first connected with Peter.
Well, Dave, it sure is a privilege and an honor to be in this conversation with you today. As you mentioned, I was so looking forward to this being a three-way conversation, including Peter. But today we'll be able to honor him in a really special way, so I'm glad to be part of that. My job title today is that I'm the Uncommon Friends Endowed Professor of Ethics at Florida Gulf Coast University in the business school. Kind of a strange title that may or may not come up later in our discussion. But let me tell you a little bit about how I got to this role, and really this will be partly my way of honoring Peter as I give this explanation. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in Boca Raton on the east coast of Florida. Today I live on the west coast. But I went to Emory University in Atlanta and did a bachelor's and master's in computer science. So I moved to Washington, D.C. for my first job and worked for IBM. And after being there about a year, I started the MBA program at the George Washington University, where Peter was on the faculty. And those of you familiar with MBA programs remember that all MBA students, no matter what they emphasize, have to take the core courses, or what sometimes are called the common body of knowledge courses. Everybody has to take accounting and marketing and international business. And then you also have to take a class that's commonly called organizational behavior or something in the behavioral sciences. And so I had started off as a finance major. And oftentimes, if you ask finance majors whether or not they think the OB class is very valuable, they really don't think so. They use derogatory terms like touchy feely and soft science and things of that nature. There's research that has shown that if you ask all MBA students to rank the value of their courses at graduation, the OB course is usually near the bottom. If you ask the same students 5 years after graduation, the OB course then is listed as the most important. So you kind of have to be out there working until it really sinks in deeply how valuable that organizational behavior course was. So I was in this OB course taught by this guy named Peter Vale, probably in there grudgingly as a finance major, being skeptical and whatnot. But at the same time, there were some things happening at work at IBM where I was kind of mystified by some of the dynamics that were taking place. And I guess to make a long story short, it was Peter's course that gave me a much more comprehensive and a much more nuanced appreciation for leadership, specifically thinking of my own management and organizational dynamics. Mm-hmm. So I was so enchanted, and so it was the most dramatic learning of my career, frankly. And so it caused me to change my major over to organizational behavior in my MBA program. And then when I finished the degree, I told IBM I'm all excited about becoming a behavioral scientist. And they said, well, that's not exactly what we've got going on here. So I became a management consultant for a number of years in the Washington, D.C. area. So for 20 years, I was in the D.C. area and fairly closely connected to Peter most of that time. To advance a few years after becoming a corporate vice president and so forth, I actually started a PhD program probably about 10 years after starting my MBA. And Peter was the director of the doctoral program. And I think he probably had created the most innovative, both research-based and practical doctoral program that you could imagine. Students were allowed to create their own courses of study, of course, with faculty approval, but we were really invited to be innovative and thoughtful in the way that we approached the selection of our courses, our supporting fields. I actually did my supporting field in individual finance. Just, the whole experience was just, it broke a lot of boundaries that are typically in place in higher education. But I started off just taking a class. I was working full time as a corporate vice president, really busy. And the very first class was one taught by Peter Vale. And I think I was just drawn further in. And I guess to make a long story short, decided to go for the PhD full time. By then I was married and had children. My wife has not worked since we've had kids. So we had a few lean years there where I just hung out my own shingle and consulted enough to pay for the mortgage and some groceries. And, when I started off, I didn't think I was going to change jobs or change my life in any way. But then by the end, I thought, you know what, higher education is probably the best platform for me to offer my skills and abilities to the world. And so really, Peter Vale, I think of as having been the critical figure in the two most significant changes of my career.
I have a word that pops up twice in what I'm hearing so far, Eric. And the same word for both instances is permission. Peter gave us permission. He widened the boundaries and lowered the floor and raised the ceiling, I think mainly because he did believe that all behavior is human, that we study and everything, every subject area has OB in it, or it is OB with the name marketing hung on it. That was something that Peter loved to say. But permission.
Yes.
And so even moving into that more blended and more freeing doctoral experience, I'm hearing that it gave you quite a bit of permission to make some choices and then to get the grain of yourself. my hunch is in the business world, starting at IBM, maybe your the groove in you and the groove in what they needed you to be for them was not always in sync.
Yes.
Picking up where you left off, I can tell from reading a little bit about you and hearing Peter talk about it. You found a nice groove within groove, a tongue and groove with a higher education sphere. Where did you start, or did you start there in Florida? To take us a little further in your story.
Yeah, and let me preface that by saying I think what I found attractive in Peter, that you've sort of characterized as permission, is he was the most integrated professor that I ever had. So it wasn't as if we were just learning a slice of life. It wasn't as if just everything that was happening to me at IBM, he spoke to in the classroom. And I even remember him doing things that would be unorthodox, like bringing women's purses to class and asking us what we made of them.
That's
And
right.
his whole point in doing that was to say that the subjectivity that occurs in so much, and how we ascribe powerful conclusions. We make powerful conclusions upon things like the design of basic objects and so forth. So
Mm-hmm.
so he was sort of both the most practical professor I had on the one hand, and the most deeply philosophic on the other.
It's a
It's a
great way
very
of putting
a
it.
very bizarre combination. But I was also privileged then, after I graduated, my first faculty appointment was back at the George Washington University. Now, most business schools won't hire their own graduates, and
That's right.
GW was no exception. So long story, but because of their initial AACSB accreditation, they'd actually farmed out a department into the Arts and Sciences College that today is called the Organizational Sciences Department.
Yeah.
So that became my home for the next 5 years. And that faculty was half organizational behavior people like me, and the other half were IO psychologists. And that was a whole eye-opening experience to me as well. Maybe just
Absolutely.
one brief anecdote was
Yeah.
the department chair was an older gentleman who he hasn't been gone that long either, Joe Zeidner, and we would very early on he would say, well, of course the seminal figures of so and so and so and so were so key. And here I thought I got this really amazing education, and I'd never heard of these people. And so, that's when I found out that academia is so stovepiped
Yeah.
that even relatively close disciplines like IO psychology and organizational behavior were separate intellectual domains. And I tried to, in some way, bring that story together in the article that I wrote about the GW organizational behavior faculty, which may come up later in our conversation. But I was fortunate to do the first 5 years at the George Washington University in the Arts and Sciences College. They had a contract with the United States Air Force
Hmm.
to teach Air Force officers in a cohort program. It was probably the best educational experience of my career.
Must have been terrific to teach those very
Yeah,
intentional learners.
they
They had a
were
lot ahead of them that they needed to do.
they were considered at the top 1% in their rank. This was a
Mm-hmm.
highly prestigious program to be in. Colin Powell, for example, had been in a very similar program at the George Washington University. He wrote about it in his biography, how impactful it was for him. But because I'd had this corporate VP experience, they right off the bat allowed me to be the program manager of this multi-million-dollar contract. After a few years, I got an opportunity to become executive director for doctoral programs in the University of Maryland system, which I did for a few years. And then in 2003, I moved to North Carolina and became the dean of the business school at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. So actually, Peter's careers and mine are sort of similar. And then we were faculty. We both became business school deans, and then we both went back to becoming faculty. So I did that after several years as dean. I was professor of leadership there. Spent a few years at one of the historically black schools in the University of North Carolina system, which is Fayetteville State University. And then in 2016, Finally made my way back to my home state of Florida after 30 some years away, where it's just a joy to be at Florida Gulf Coast University, the newest public university in the Florida system, and to have this unique job, which, like I said, could come up later. This notion of the uncommon friends that's in my job title.
I think when I try to capture my life in recent months with Peter Vale, I'd steal that title because it was not likely that those of us who've been away for a long, long while, even though Peter and I would connect by phone occasionally, I'd look in on him and he loved to have me tell him what I was doing. But what an uncommon friend for
Yes,
you and me to have, who
yes.
also was a terrific teacher and a unique thinker. We really have a gift there. I will want to make a quick point about Pembroke. We've decided on the website that we would like to have those who care to make a contribution, and I'm having a guy work on how to make that happen. What I really would like it to do, if it would be okay with you, right here on air, and you can say no, and I'll edit it, is to say that if they want to, put in a few dollars, whatever they feel like, if they were getting value from this, from the listening, that it could go to the scholarship that honors Peter by name.
Oh, that would be great. Back in 2004, my wife Amy and I endowed actually a facultyship award, and I was really trying
Good.
to honor a faculty member like Peter. But I've had some conversation about how the AACSB requirements and other aspects of higher education make it so that it's not necessarily easy to be the kind of faculty member that he was. And so I tried to put some of those attributes down into this award and make it available to faculty who earn it. It's not awarded every year. It's judged by a committee, and but it's named for Peter Vale, and so that's one way of honoring his legacy. That university's in the third poorest county in America, so it's
all the better.
A resource poor county. So yeah, that would be a wonderful gesture on the part of any of the listeners.
There's a quick symmetry that I want to point out between how I guided my career. I've always chosen to work in the public side of higher education, and particularly in underserved areas, including Western Maine when I was a dean up there for some years. I just felt that if I was going to be a profound teacher, either in the classroom and through my administrative actions as a continuing education innovator, that I wanted to be where it could make the most difference, yet it would be the most difficult to see the consequences right away. Whereas when I taught as a visiting professor at my alma mater, Colby, for 1 year in the mid-'80s, these kids came in already, the battery's fully charged, and I didn't know, what am I going to add here?
Yes.
Whereas when I was working out there, you had to really be innovative, really had to be creative to get them to be confident enough to come through the door and then to stay, and then to start to see that even though their future level at this point looked like the end of their toes in terms of flatness, that there was something there to aspire to. Yes. And so I think both of us have wonderful, coincidentally, and maybe not so coincidentally because of our uncommon friend, have found that that's where the real satisfaction is. So having some contribution in that direction would be terrific.
Yes.
It's interesting because there was an endowment in my name, Fearon Scholarship, connected to Joseph Duran, whose work I studied and then taught. And so there's a Fearon Duran and a Peter Vale.
Oh, neat.
I'll skim a little money off to the Fearon Duran because it focuses on the very same thing, that the Duran scholars are people who, in my kind of school, sometimes work 3 jobs just to, pay their due, pay their way. And one of them, and I'm getting back to you in a moment, is Brittany Ernst, who is one of our interludes when you look at the full podcast series. Brittany chose to go from us to the University of North Carolina, and she just finished in organization science. She just finished and defended her dissertation last week, Brittany Ernst. And she's coming back to Connecticut as in the leadership development of Travelers University in the HR arena, but her goal was to be an academic, someone who is a really smart researcher, really great in analytical skills, but a whole lot of robust leadership on her own part that she got rewarded for all the time she was at my school and beyond. So a Farron Duran scholar named Brittany Ernst is on our list already, and
Oh, great.
now maybe at some point we'll find out the awardee at
Yeah.
Pembroke and have him or her come on.
Yeah.
Back to you, Eric.
Yeah. No, you're right. I think we share a calling in that starting in year 2000, from 2000 to 2016, I was at three universities that were all minority serving institutions. And Florida Gulf Coast, where I am today, is not, but it's also a high percentage of first generation college. So that would
Yes.
also be what was in common from 2000 on. I've been totally devoted to institutions that are serving, like you said. It's I find it personally more gratifying to be able to work with people and see them make transformative progress rather than take someone who's already got everything working in their favor, and probably you can help them at the margin. So yeah, we do share that in common.
Okay, you can't hold our listeners in suspense any longer. Well, tell us about the uncommon. I mean,
Oh, okay.
unknown, uncommon friend. Yes.
Yeah. Just real quickly, my position, the endowment was created to honor a man named James Newton, who wrote a book called The Uncommon Friends. And just through the coincidence of his life, he became intimate friends with five people. Real quickly, I'll say Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, Harvey Firestone, a Nobel Prize winning scientist named Alexis Carrel, and Charles Lindbergh.
I think
And
I've heard
so,
of them. I just think I've heard of them.
yeah,
What a
yeah, actually,
fantastic person.
most people don't know about Alexis Carrel, but he won the Nobel Prize, I think, in 1912 for his work. Allowed the first type of open heart surgeries. He did work on vascular suturing. His work allowed for people to essentially stop bleeding to death. So there's an argument to be made that these five uncommon friends were the five who ushered in the 20th century, if you will, from everything to lights to medical breakthroughs to aerospace breakthroughs and so forth. So this guy Jim Newton just happened to be kind of at the center, and he was seemed to be a really special person, so that these five people sought him out,
Wow.
and he just became intimate friends with them. And so he wrote this book primarily focused on their friendship. They had, in some cases, they had some significant philosophical differences, but he really thought that their integrity and their character and their ethics were what allowed them to be so successful. So since 1993, there's been a thriving nonprofit organization in Southwest Florida called the Uncommon Friends Foundation. And it exists to do exactly that: foster character development, integrity, and ethics. And it's my privilege to be sort of the business arm of that organization that also has curriculum in the K to 12 schools. We award 20 or so college scholarships each year. And so it's kind of a unique faculty role to be in, and I'm just enjoying it immensely.
What a great association for you at this stage of your career. I think that one of the things we're learning during the debacle of this pandemic and how many people are now having to step away from what they felt to be normal in regard to what they would do every day. It kind of brings you back to, okay, well, where am I going to find my energy if it's not through the terms of my employment or my having my coworkers at my
Right.
elbow and all of that. And one of the Zoom calls I was on this morning was just to that point. After things fall away, what do you bring? What are you
Yes.
going to bring forward? And well, one thing we bring forward is all of the most important influences in our life, as did Newton. Those people influenced him, and he appreciated it, and he wrote about it. And apparently,
Yes.
some wealth was created from that, which is carrying on some wonderful service to this moment. I've had enough of those moments because I sought them or I was sought out for them that I've kind of done the same sort of thing. Talk about first in their family, the Travelers Corporation wanted to develop a relationship with my school, so I basically worked that connection for months and months, doing everything possible to get travelers to take a look at our student body and value them where they were easily looking at the named business schools. Anyway, that led to us being entrusted with the first of a number of grants in a program called EDGE, or uh, Empowering Dreams for Graduation and Employment.
Oh, neat.
And the term of EDGE was that they would be in the minority underserved population of our area, which has tremendous amount of poverty, and unfortunately, a lot of them are not. They don't look like me. Anyway, we pulled that together. We built it, and when I retired, it was well ingrained. And Travelers has now spent a lot of money. It's a very focused program. 5 a year we work with, got them all the way through.
Wow.
Almost all of them are either working at Travelers or in the industry. And I can tell you, it probably like your students, they had no idea that they'd be working in insurance or dealing in the fast-paced, agile aspects of Travelers right now. All those things in the bowels of this very big established Hartford company.
Yeah.
So wonderful story. Tell me now then, as you're in this position, first thing I got to know is what do you think was that attraction that Newton had to these people who could have easily begged off even a 5-minute conversation back then at the early part of the 20th century? What was his specialness, do you think?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, Dave, because one of the things I point out to my students is when Jim Newton met Thomas Edison, Newton was 19 years old. He had moved to Fort Myers. I think Thomas Edison was 76 or 77 at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I challenge my students, is there someone 60 years older than you that you are willing to and going out of your way to kind of foster a relationship with? So some of those relationships, he was the junior partner, if you will, and these folks were clearly mentors and proteges to him. Charles Lindbergh and he were born about the same time, so they had a much more peer relationship. But the Charles Lindbergh story is quite interesting because if you're familiar with him, he really shunned the public as much as he possibly could. He was just, as you know, he lost a child. His first son was kidnapped and murdered, and so that probably just completely underscored his unwillingness to try to do anything at all with the public. So
Mm-hmm.
so for him to kind of have an open friendship with Jim Newton and to find Jim the kind of friend that he could be himself with, I think really speaks a lot to Jim's personality. He just had, he had the kind of personality that I think people felt attracted to, felt comfortable with, knew that he would be confidential. I mean, all of these were very public figures, right? So they can't just be saying anything to people that they would suspect are going to, in today's terminology, leak to the news or what have you. So Jim had that kind of winsome personality.
And
So
he must have been born with discretion
yeah,
in his
yes,
genes to
yes.
get that far. How did he become wealthy?
Well, actually, he believe it or not, and this might get us afield of the Peter Vale discussion, but he spent his entire career working for an organization where he wasn't paid. So when he retired, the story is he only had a roll of quarters to his name. So it wasn't his own wealth that started the people in the community. He had a number of other friends much later than Charles Lindbergh, who died in 1974. Newton lived till 1999. So the impact that he had in Southwest Florida after returning here in 1967 for the next 30 years drew so many people to him that this was all done in his honor. So he did start a real estate business from scratch in 1967. So even though he was 62 years old or so when he returned, he made a good living the last 10 or 15 years of his working life. but it was really the funds came from other individuals to honor Jim.
Wow. And did you have a chance to meet him in person, or
I
had you not
didn't. You
moved
know,
down
he
there?
he passed in 1999, and
Came
I
down there.
really didn't
Yeah.
even know about him till 2016.
Are you still hearing about him?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, there are just, he was the kind of person where if you talk to anyone in this community who knew him when he was alive, and his wife also the same way, she lived to 2004. She was 104 when she passed. If you mention either of their names to people that got an opportunity to meet them, their faces just light up, and they just immediately tell you what incredible people they were.
We've talked about practice in this series, and sometimes it could be very concrete. Like Peter used to tease me because earlier in our recorded collaboration, I was trying to find the golfer in me because I was trying very hard at it, and he would laugh. And he said, Dave, the day you stop saying you're playing golf and say that you're a golfer, you'll know what practice is at that level. But it could be as typical as golfing,
Yes,
or it could be as um, a Jim Newton kind of practice, which
right.
you can't put a role, a title, or it was just his. Essentially, he must have been a gatherer
Yes,
of incredibly interesting people,
yes,
but he didn't exploit that. He didn't say, "Oh, I'm going to convert this into some bucks." And that's why I can get to the question of how it is that you're teaching in ethics. What when you arrived in that role, I can't imagine that you would look on paper like a traditional resume of an ethicist
correct.
or philosophy guy or all the other ways that I can imagine, and also that you're in the business side of it. So talk about that evolution in you for
Yes,
a moment, Eric. We've got a bit more time.
yeah. Um, as you correctly point out, when I applied for the job and went through the interview process and so forth, I was very clear with the the committee, that I am not by any stretch of the imagination sort of a pure ethicist. There are people who essentially get their PhD in that area,
Mm-hmm.
but I think largely because of Peter's influence on me, I did not start I started academic career mid-career,
Mm.
so I didn't start thinking in terms of these stovepipes the way that most academicians have to today. So, I have publications in philosophy and psychology and consulting and spirituality, in systems science, um, in education. What I'm extremely proud of is my interdisciplinary record of scholarship, which is not necessarily always valued in higher education, believe it or not. But so I was able to tell the committee, I've got a couple articles in ethics, but I have others in sustainability. I have others in workplace spirituality. If you're willing to interpret that chair broadly, then I think I'm well qualified, but I'm certainly not that pure ethicist. So the committee was willing to interpret it that way, and so then I think I ended up being a good fit.
Well, I now have a even better idea why Peter was eager to have us talk with you, because I think he would have been going check, 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 check with each of the domains that you put your thought to, and they were willing to record it and sell it and send it out. Uh, Goes really back to one of his great passions, which was the systems, the systems dynamic and
Yes,
the social technical aspects. But he was frustrated, I'm sure, and maybe that's why your doctoral program was so unique, because he just couldn't take all those stovepipes.
right.
It bugged him because he was curious and interested anywhere where people organized to get
Yes.
things done, whether it was a nonprofit So I'm so delighted that because of Mr. Newton's unbelievable reputation, people were willing and wanting to have someone who is uh, comfortable and moving intellectually, spiritually, as well as personally into wherever there was an opportunity to make a difference. So really cool. What
Yeah,
do you, what do you, what do you, Peter would say this, I hear it in my ear. What are you working on now, right, Eric? What,
yeah.
what's on your
Well,
computer?
yeah. And let me also just underscore what you said. I think for me, probably in OD language, we would say Peter was very much a socio-technical systems person.
You would agree.
And to me, that was very attractive. And back when I consulted full time, the unique situations that I would often particularly be called into were those where they needed someone with behavioral science knowledge, which a lot of people have. But then I had a computer science background, so there aren't too many people with the technical and the behavioral. But then to add to it, I did end up minoring still in finance in my MBA program, and I did a supporting field of individual finance for my PhD and worked as a corporate vice president in the financial field. So if you bring that intersection of behavioral sciences, technology, and finance, there just aren't that many. We're stovepiped as a society, right? There just aren't many people that can bring together even three fields like that. Well, as to what I'm working on right now, believe it or not, I've become more and more interested in Jim Newton and his wife Ellie, who have left the scene for now 20 years, but they've both spent their careers working for a nonprofit organization for no pay at all, as did as many as 3,000 of their colleagues. And it's an organization called Moral Rearmament. And so it started as a Christian evangelical organization, but what I was able to discover was that this organization also had tremendous impact on business. So I was learning more about Jim and Ellie Newton kind of as my hobby, but once I discovered that they'd been involved in some real significant business improvement, then I said, "Wow, I can now study this professionally." So the article that I have under review right now is the story of it's a historical piece. So it's under review at the Journal of Management History, one of the top journals, and it's the story of this moral rearmament group being called into Miami, Florida, 1951, into the airline industry that was serving Latin America at the time. So all of the flights out of to and from Latin America were headquartered in Miami. And 1948, the smallest of the airlines was called National Airlines. They were selected for the target of a strike, and so the pilots, mechanics, and machinists engaged in a 9-month strike against National Airlines. Strike was settled in November of 1948. President Harry Truman was involved. This was big stuff. Longest strike in history to that point in the airline industry. Really bad blood on both sides. The head of the Pilots Association said, "For his money," essentially quoting him, "for my money, things were worse after the strike was settled than they were before." By 1951, the Pilots Association in particular has said, "You know what, in January, we're going to start a strike. And we're just going to keep the strike going until the company's bankrupt. We're all going to lose our jobs, but we can get other jobs. This company, things are so bad, we don't care. We're going to just bring it all down." And
Can't
so,
imagine it being any worse at that point.
yes, and they were doing crazy things like the pilots would give passengers rough rides. They would intentionally give them flights where people would be vomiting, and then if the passengers complained, they'd say, "Well, don't fly our airline anymore." And I mean, can you imagine?
Oh, it's horrible.
The owner and managers of the airlines would call for arbitrary physicals. You'd show up for work and it's for your flight, and they'd say, "Well, we can't put you behind in the cockpit until you pass a physical." And they'd have a doctor right there, and the doctor would examine them and say, "Oh my gosh, too bad, you failed your physical, so you're not allowed to work now for X period of time." So just incredibly bad ill will on both sides. So there were two gentlemen in Miami who were familiar with moral rearmament. December 1950, they went to the managers of these owners and executives of these four airlines and said, "This can't continue, right? This is bad for everybody." We know about this organization. We know about their success in mediating, and would you give them a try? So the owners and executives of the airlines, this moral rearmament was having a conference in January 1951 in Washington, D.C. They sent about a half dozen of their owners and executives there. The pilots union, machinists union, mechanics union also sent half a dozen of their union executives to this meeting. These 12 people had never laid eyes on each other than across a negotiating table. They went to the conference, got exposed to the ideas, and at the end of the meeting said, let's start to talk. Let's see what we can do. And they immediately dispensed with 90% of the grievances that had been filed. And so they started as leadership on both sides to reconcile. But they realized that the ill will that they had both created had left thousands of employees back in Miami that still had that ill will. So the months of April and May, 170 moral rearmament staff, all working for free, full time, come to Miami to essentially do an OD intervention in the airline industries. Other organizations wanted in on it as well. Our big Florida utility is Florida Power and Light. They wanted it on it. The largest department store chain, which is today part of Macy's, was Burdines. They wanted in on it. These interventions touched maybe 15% of the population of Miami at that time. And can I go on more, or am I taking up too much time?
No, we got a few more minutes, and I think that this is really developing still another view of another sort of practice, which is mediation.
Yeah. And so let me tell you their method, which is it would be completely unorthodox today, but I think it honors Peter Vale in some ways. That I tried in this research article to surface what I think allowed them to be so successful. So the end of the story is when they leave in May, everybody's hugging each other. They made a movie. They made a major motion picture about the success of this project. That motion picture was funded some of it was paid for by the corporations, but the rest of it was paid for by contributions from mechanics, contributions from pilots and stewardesses. They paid out of their own pocket to make this movie and to write a book explaining about the turnaround that took place there. So I tried to study, well, how on earth, how do you go from hating each other literally to within 6 months, complete turnaround. And I discovered some aspects that I think contributed to it that would be very integrated, but have largely been lost to history and are missing today. One of those I've already mentioned. If 170 volunteers show up, it's not like having Booz Allen consultants there, where they're billing you by the hour. They have a different motivation than you do, right? They're trying to generate, and they're trying to serve you, but at the same time, they're generating revenue. They're looking for add-on work and so forth. So these people are out. They're only there out of the goodness of their heart.
Absolutely. That's step one for a big step.
Yep. Another one that's completely missing from today is because this was a volunteer organization, even though as many as 3,000 people may have spent 30 years in it full time without pay. So their expenses were covered, but what that usually meant was they stayed in the homes of the mechanics, the executives, the stewardesses. So they ate dinner with these people. After dinner, they brought 8, 10, 12 neighbors in for discussion about these principles, which included things like absolute honesty, making decisions based not about who's right, but about what is right. So I think those two were there's several others that I could go into, but those two were just critical. So if you start to make the decision based on what's right, then you have to include the other party. It's not just you pushing for your own agenda. So they're in the homes of these people. Another one that's kind of bizarre today was out of those 170 people that came, half of them were involved in the production of plays. So, Peter actually taught a course at George Washington University shortly after I left about essentially the role of movies in explaining organizational behavior dynamics. You and I have had conversation about his love of poetry.
Yep.
So this group was similar in that way. They found that they could share and teach their principles through theater um, as effectively, if not more effectively, than in a training room of a business. So, what consulting firms turn to their clients and say, tonight, as part of our OD intervention, we're going to go to the theater and we're going to watch this production. But they staged two plays over that 2 month period. Both of them were about reconciliation of parties who were at loggerheads with each other. But seeing it dramatized, I think, hits us in a completely different way. The final one that I'll mention is that the training really consisted primarily of what I would call confessions. They basically brought in speaker after speaker who said, I was completely at loggerheads with another human being, with another organization, what have you. And because of the four principles, which are absolute love, absolute unselfishness, absolute purity, absolute honesty, when I and the other party agreed to these terms and agreed to do things based on what is right, not on who's right, it completely transformed our relationship. So you were sort of uh, pummeled almost with testimony after testimony, and many of these were extremely dramatic. So after the Miami airline incident, several of these people now became confessors to other organizations for the next couple of decades. But some of them were dramatic on the order of moral rearmament. Many people credit with bringing about reconciliation between French and Germans after World War II. So a frequent speaker was a French woman who said, I hated the Germans. They tortured my son during World War II. I didn't even want to look at another German human being, but moral rearmament allowed my heart to change and allowed me that kind of reconciliation. So we're talking about dramatic, almost unthinkable hatred being converted to love, if you want to use a word that we don't use in the workplace, but Peter would be very comfortable with that word.
He would be, and I think he would have been really intrigued with this story, in part because you're studying now the Newton and down through the Newton family tree and all their influences, and then looking at this connection to this organization that's been active in doing such remarkable things. As a layman, I'm thinking, boy, do we not need this now?
Yes.
Particularly as we look at our national politics. But it's put energy into it. It's giving you another. I asked you initially, what's your latest product you're working on? And so in many ways, and unfortunately we are at the time limit coming up here, Eric, I know exactly why my other hand here, the invisible hand,
Yes.
Peter Vale, wanted me to have this conversation. And I'm spiritual enough to believe that it's not bored. There's no boundary with Peter Vale, including wherever his soul and spirit has taken him now. Let's shift to, in the last minute, to, if you could speak to Peter right now, what would you want to say to him?
Well, firstly, I think I would thank him. I would want to, I think he knows that story, my story, and those two transformative changes. He may not know the following story, which I know is very corny, but I've put it in a eulogy. Um, when he was he was not only the director of the doctoral program, he also became my own dissertation director. And so for about 3 years, that was my most frequent contact with him. I probably had lengthy conversations once a week over a 3 year period.
Yep.
And every one of those conversations, I left with my worldview expanded. My knowledge increased, my perspectives opened up. And so, my little corny analogy is, if people wonder, what is it like to go to heaven where you spend infinity, you can't sit on a cloud eating bonbons. That's got to get boring over time. In fact, I just watched the final episode of The Good Place, which is a show about ethics. And that's basically what they conclude. You run out of stuff to do. But I never ran out of appreciation for those conversations. So I feel like, to me, I wouldn't mind spending eternity with my horizon constantly expanding, my perspectives opened up, my knowledge greatly increasing. I would thank Peter for those career changes, and I would share with him that particular anecdote.
Well, also, it took me 3 years of Peter's shepherding in many conversations where I said, I can't do it, Peter. I got 2 kids. I got but I got there. In fact, when he signed it, he said, okay, now I'm leaving for George Washington University to become the dean. So that was our historical connection there.
Yes.
But the other thing I want to say in closing about your notion is, could you just make a little more room for me? I'd love to be sitting with you and Peter and continuing this.
There's an infinite amount of room in eternity, right?
You got it.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you again. And maybe we'll come back in another time, but this has been a very rich way of, within just a week of when Peter passed away, to celebrate his life and what it's meant to our lives. So thank you, Eric.
I would love to do it again, Dave. It's been my privilege, my honor, and the way that you are honoring your relationship with Peter Vail is just an inspiration to me.
Thank you.